Welcome to Monterey's Magical History Tour with Tim Thomas. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Very excited. We have two special guests on today. Just a couple little house rules before we get going. I ask that if everyone could please mute themselves during the presentation, try to help limit any distractions. And then if questions do arise, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will read them out loud at the end of the presentation. Or if you would like, hold on to your questions till the very end, and we will have some time for question and answering, and you can unmute yourself, and then we'll go from there. But after that, Tim, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I think we set some kind of Monterey Library record with the amount of people who signed up for this program today. I appreciate that. So I think, Sean, this is what, the 8th or 9th one we've done so far, something like that?
This is the 9th one. Yeah.
Very good. So I think we've got a really special program today. Of course, this is about Ed Ricketts and the making and writing of Between Pacific Tides. And I think it's a subject that a lot of us are interested in, especially any of us who grew up in Monterey, like I did. And I think we have a couple of really excellent speakers who, of course, have their new book out, which I have with me. I don't think you can actually see it, but I hold it up, but you probably can't see it. But I'm sure you have pictures of it in your presentation. Show us covers of it. I highly recommend it. I'll tell you this, and Don, you guys probably already know this. The book is very popular. I actually ordered it way back in early December. I knew it was coming out later, and it still took 2 or 3 weeks after it came out before I actually received my copy of it. So you guys, that's good. Be out there. So what I know about Between Pacific Tides, of course, is a sort of ecological view of the tide pools. When it was written, it was sort of a revolutionary for its time, and I think our two speakers will really get into that whole subject matter today. So I'd like to introduce them. We have today with us Richard Astro, who is the provost emeritus and distinguished professor of English at Drexel University. And Donald Kohrs, who I've known for a long time, is the branch library specialist at the Harold A. Miller Library of Stanford University, Hopkins Marine Station in Pacific Grove. So I'm going to turn it over to you, I think, and we'll go from there.
Hello, everybody. My name is Donald Kohrs. I am at the Harold A. Miller Library, Hopkins Marine Station, Pacific Grove, California. I'm going to tell you briefly a little bit how this whole project got started. As my position at Hopkins Marine Station in the Miller Library. Get my PowerPoint going. Here I am at the Chautauqua Hall in Pacific Grove, famous historical building. My co-author, Richard Astro, pictured here at Ed Ricketts Laboratory, Pacific Biological Laboratories in Monterey, California, along Cannery Row. And here is the book that we're going to talk to you a little bit about today, A Tidal Odyssey, Ed Ricketts and the Making of Between Pacific Tides by Astro and Donald Kohrs. Available at Amazon if you want to go shopping later today. So most of everybody knows Ed Ricketts as the character Doc in John Steinbeck's Cannery Row, which was published January 1945 by Viking Press. Some people also know Ed by a book that he got published, named Between Pacific Tides, with his co-author, Jack Calvin, published in March of 1939, some 6 years earlier before Cannery Row, by Stanford University Press. Some also know of Sea Cortez by John Steinbeck and his co-author, Ed Ricketts, about their travel down into the Gulf of California. That one published December 7th, 1941 by Viking Press. And here is a picture of the Harold A. Miller Library, where I'm located at pretty much 5 days a week, with lots of stacks of books that date back to 1880s and 1890s and moving forward. A wonderful collection of material. And here is a picture of what we call the Alexander Agassiz building, pictured here in 1918, the building that Ed Ricketts would have known when he arrived in 1923 to Pacific Grove, California. That building is still standing today. And here is a bust of Ed Flanders Rob Ricketts that sits in my library in Pacific Grove, California, at the Harold A. Miller Library. So here I get this bust of Ed. And I have to think to myself, well, what is it that's in Ed's head? And there's lots of material within my library that helps me figure that out. I find along the books that are on my shelves, that some of them contain book plates. Ed Ricketts, gift book plates, says gift of Ed Ricketts. And I say to myself, where did these come from? Well, when Ed got hit by the train, his collection that was in Pacific Biological Laboratories was donated to Stanford University, and a good bit of it was assimilated into my library. So here I am, I begin my work in the Harold A. Miller Library. Some 14 years ago, I begin to find these scatterings of Ed Ricketts, shall we say. His Ricketts bound reprints, more Ricketts bound reprints, his index reprints collections, what Ed called Ed separates, more of his reprint collection, Ed separates as he referred to them, which are reprint collections of papers, one-offs. And these cards, this is a reprint card for a separate identifying Dora Henry that he has, a longtime oceanographer, professor at the University of Washington, an authority on the life history of biology and Pacific Coast invertebrates. So not only do I have the card, I have amongst my collection that particular separate that Ed Ricketts owned with his Pacific Biological Lab stamp on it, as he accessions and entered all this material into his bibliography, as he's going to cross-reference a number of different books and gather all his scientific information together. Yet here's another one from Dora Henry. Now, in the book, The Sea of Cortez, John Steinbeck describes some of the unusual barnacles and how they sent some of these specimens off to the barnacle lady. And that's what Ed had to do. Ed arrived on the West Coast, begins the project of identifying species of marine invertebrates along the coast for the work that he's doing with Pacific Biological Laboratories, which is the laboratory supply house for universities, high schools, museums. Here's that exact reprint. I find it in my collection. So this is just an example of how I can spend my days in the Miller Library identifying connections with Ed Ricketts. That's in my library. And the Pacific Biological Laboratory stamp, as I showed you before, as he tries to cross-reference all this information. He also has his Pacific Biological Survey cards for collections that he did along the coast of invertebrates in the shoreline from Monterey, Southern California, and Baja California. Here's a survey card, a specimen obtained in April 13th, 1925, identified by the Walter K. Fisher. It was collected by a cod fisherman out of Santa Cruz. So there's not just Walter K. Fisher that identifies specimens for Ricketts. Ricketts seems to be spending lots of time gathering the help of scientists at Hopkins Marine Station to help him identify the specimens that he was collecting. And he's not collecting just in Monterey. He's up and down the coast of California, Oregon, Washington, and into Alaska. But he also connects with a lot of visiting scientists at Hopkins Marine Stations. Some would become renowned researchers or were renowned researchers when he met them. Henry Bigelow, Torsten Gislin, Henry O'Donoghue, Wayland Vaughn, all these scientists Ed sends specimens to or finds while they're visiting at Hopkins, connects with them, asking them to identify specimens for him of these invertebrates of the shore that he's been collecting. Like I say, Between Pacific Tides, the book that we talk about in our book is an account of the habits and habitats of some 500 of the common conspicuous seashore invertebrates of the Pacific coast from Sitka, Alaska, and northern Mexico. Ed's gonna travel the coast. He's gonna travel the coast in his Packards. He owns 2 of them. Here's a survey card. Ed's all the way down to Ensenada, Mexico in May of 1925, right? that shows you he's arrived in 1923 to Pacific Grove, helped establish Pacific Biological Laboratories, and by May of 1925, he's in Ensenada, Mexico. Here's where he's collecting at, Estero de Puta Banda in Ensenada. What a beautiful location on the intertidal zone. Again, another wonderful picture of Estero de Puta Banda in Mexico that Ed visits and collects from 1925. And then again, he's down in 1930 at a place called the Halfway House. We find this in another survey card. Lower California, February 12th, 1930. I say to myself, where is the Halfway House? How could I ever find that? Well, there's this thing that they have now that's called Google. And you put it, the word Halfway House, Lower California, into Google. And what do you find? The location of where this halfway house, where Ed's visiting, halfway between Tijuana and Ensenada. And lo and behold, here's a picture of the halfway house, some 25 kilometers south of Rosarita, the legendary halfway house. Opened as a cantina in 1922 on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Here's the view of the halfway house from the back. Not a bad view, good place to collect specimens. Ed's going to gather all this information together, and with the help of Jack Calvin and Richie Lovejoy, he's going to put this book together, and Stanford University Press is going to publish it. Here's a survey card again for a specimen obtained in 1928, collected by Chin Yip, identified by Henry Bigelow. Now, who's Chin Yip? Chin Yip, it turns out, is a Chinese fisherman that lives very close to Pacific Biological Laboratories, just a few blocks up. If you know where today is the Wave Street Studio, that's where Chin Yip lived. And he collected for Ed Ricketts for probably 20 to 25 years. He was one of his primary sources for collecting specimens. Here's the Wave Street Studio. That little house up on top there, that actually used to be a professor named Jacques L'Herb's house. That was at the foot of David Avenue, where now is the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Well, they moved that house up there, and it became Chin Yip's house, 744 Wave Street, where in 1932 was reported to the Monterey Police today that 22 chickens were stolen from the poultry yard last night. A fence of the yard was torn down. So we've got connection with Chin Yip. Chin Yip, born in 1881, Pacific Grove's Chinese fishing village. He and his family moved to Maccabees Beach, 1906. American citizen, able to purchase the lot 744 Wave Street to serve as, and we think Chin Yip was likely the character, was quite possibly served as the character for the old Chinaman in Steinbeck's Cannery Row. Mention of the fence in Cannery Row, it all pretty much fits to communications I have with Jerry Lo Sabado. Not only do I have the cards and correspondences, I start searching for layers of correspondences that don't exist just at Stanford University in their special collections. And one person suggested, hey, Dom, why don't you connect with Stanford University Press and ask them if they have any correspondence related to the publishing of Between Pacific Tides. So I send an email off to Stanford University Press, think I'd never hear from them again. But lo and behold, I receive an email that says, Dom, we have 3 manila file folders of correspondences telling the story, back and forth correspondences between Ricketts and SUP, Stanford University Press, about the publishing of Between Pacific Tides. And that's the book that Ed Ricketts, Jack Calvin, and Richie Lovejoy put together and get published by 1939 that radically changes the view of the intertidal zone, looking at it in terms of habitat. And that's the story in this book, along with a whole bunch of other stories that we had. And this book was not put together just by myself and Richard Astro. We had a whole lot of help from a whole lot of other people I mentioned below. Ed Ricketts Jr., Ed Ricketts' son, Nancy Ricketts, Ed's daughter, Lisa Ricketts, who was Ed Ricketts' niece, Steve Webster, Chuck Baxter, Susan Schillingall, Will Ray, Robert Walter, Vicki and John Pierce, Jim Watanabe, Rick Bruska, Jim Carlton, Pat Hathaway, Jerry Losabado, Michael Hemp, Dennis Copeland, Tim Thomas, Sean Briscoe, Joe Weibel, Chris Patton, Stanford Libraries, Tim Noakes, Keith Benson, Bob Dees, George Baird, Mike Gardino, Greg Kaye, and everyone else we forgot to thank. Now, with that short introduction, I'm going to leave it over to Richard Astro, who's going to tell you more about what's in the book.
Well, I think Don set the table very, very nicely. And listen, thanks to you all for taking the time to join us tonight. It's great to see an old friend, Bob DeMott, who he and I have been in this business longer than either one of us, I think, can count. And it's really special that we believe Nancy Ricketts, Ed's daughter, is with us from Sitka, Alaska. And she's been a cheerleader for Don and for me since we started this project. And I just want to say thank you, Nancy. You're absolutely wonderful, and it's great that you can join us. Now, when you come south from Sitka, in fact, almost 1,000 miles south, you'll see the vista at Brackett's Landing, just south of Edmonds, Washington, a little north of Seattle. And you'll see the ferries that run back and forth to the San Juan Islands. And if you look down right at this vista, you'll see an inscription that reads, "To stand at the edge of the sea, to sense the ebb and the flow of the tides, to feel the breath of a mist over a great salt marsh, is to have knowledge of things as nearly eternal as any earthly life can be." Ed Ricketts collected marine invertebrates along the shores of Puget Sound throughout the 30s and into the 40s. He could well have penned these lines, but no, they were written by Rachel Carson in The Edge of the Sea. Carson had probably never been to Brackett's Landing, but the plaque bearing her inscription, when it was placed there, was there because she was already recognized for better of a half century as one of America's first great environmentalists. Ed Ricketts had been famous for a half century as well, but as Don pointed out, his fame accrued chiefly as a character in someone else's fiction. Only a handful of scientists and a select group of enthusiasts we call Edheads knew the real Ricketts. For most people, he's the doc in Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday who drinks beer and milkshakes and tips his hat to dogs. In fact, he's a character in a half dozen Steinbeck novels and short stories. And even many Edheads don't understand the depth of his contribution to marine ecology, to an understanding of life on the seashore that paved the way to spheres of knowledge that have quietly, inferentially influenced so many, including Carson herself in the very book from which the lines I read appear. That's what Don and I set out to do in the Tidal Odyssey, to show through a discussion of the writing and publishing history of Between Pacific Tides that Ricketts was a serious and an accomplished scientist, the first to provide us with a comprehensive guide to marine life in the intertidal zone of the Central Pacific coast, in which, as Don has already indicated, the animals are studied in terms of their relations with one another and with the habitats in which they live, influenced by wave shock, by tidal patterns, and by bottom type. Now, the fact is, there are those admirers of Ricketts who will claim that he was a collector, not a scientist. After all, they say that's what he did. He collected and then ship specimens to high schools, to colleges, to museums for use in biology classes. They suggest that Ed's way of seeing was imprecise, somehow inexact, that it obstructed the understanding of assumptions that underlie concepts. They argued that the quantification of concepts that are not inherent properties of ecosystems are not always supported by empirical observation. But I ask, one must ask, where is the line between observational and quantifiable knowledge? And I'd argue that they are connected. And it's in between Pacific tides, I think, that we see this connection, this connectedness, as well as what I think may be his greatest achievement, which was to make his insights about the intertidal world accessible not only to working scientists, but to anyone who has wondered about life along the seashore. You know, Steinbeck knew this, and he would fall into that category of non-scientist who was influenced by Ed. He wrote the preface to the second edition of Tides, and he penned these words: "There are good things to see in the tide pools, and there are exciting and interesting thoughts to be generated from the sea. Every new eye applied to the peephole which looks out at the world may fish in some new beauty, some new pattern, and the world of the human mind must be enriched by such fishing." Ed was a supremely tolerant human being. He lived by a code of what he called understanding acceptance. There were very few things or people he intensely disliked. But at the top of his list were what he called dry ball scientists, or a cloistered elect who talked only to one another. By contrast, Ed Ricketts was always sharing, he was forever sharing what he learned at the seashore with anyone who was interested and would listen. That's how he reached Don and me, a librarian and an English teacher. That's how he reached an undergraduate, Tim Wooten, who chanced upon Between Pacific Tides in college, was inspired by Ed, is now himself a respected marine ecologist at the University of Chicago. That's how he reached Bill Morrison, a teacher at a First Nations school that we talked to him on the west coast of Vancouver Island. The self-proclaimed Ed head himself, Morrison created a habitat-based aquarium a la Ricketts, which is on your right here, in Euclides. Ed's non-teleological thinking underpins Steinbeck's rejection of party activism in Indubious Battle. His knowledge of marine ecology informs the Joad narrative in The Grapes of Wrath. It explains biology as a function of myth in Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. And his work in the tide pools of Central California informed Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who came to Pacific Grove in the late 1990s to explore the tide pools in the Hewitt transect behind the Hopkins Marine Station. Ed taught everyone, wrote Steinbeck, without even seeming to. Now, more often than not, Sea of Cortez is cited as the source of Ricketts's thinking, his science, his philosophy. The narrative portion of that volume that Steinbeck crafted from Ricketts's journal during their collecting expedition to the Gulf of California contains a lot of Ricketts's ideas on matters scientific and philosophical. But in that volume, Ricketts's science is relegated to an appendix, a record of the specimens he and his shipmates collected. Philosophy and science, the former in the narrative, the latter in a phyletic catalog. Now, It's in Between Pacific Tides, published 2 years before Sea of Cortez, where the complex web of Ricketts's thinking is integrated into a comprehensive whole. It's also in Tides, in the history of the writing and publishing of that book, where we see an accomplished scientist, a tireless, hardworking professional. That's what Don and I focused on in our narrative. And we hope that in reading it, you'll see a new side of Ed Ricketts, one that has heretofore been either neglected or at least very understated. You'll see correspondence between Ricketts and some of the most widely respected scientists of his time. Henry Bryan Bigelow, the founding director of Woods Hole, and he was the director on the right, not on the left, but I love that picture. Waldo Schmidt at the Smithsonian, Elizabeth Dykman at Harvard, Austin Clark and C.R. Schumacher at the National Museum, Henry August Pillsbury at the National Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia, who always addressed Ed as Dr. Ricketts, certain that he was credentialed, though as we all know, he never even graduated from college. You'll see Ricketts in letters to and from a small circle of scientific friends who were with him in Monterey for a significant period of time. People like Torsten Gieslen from Sweden, George McGinnity from Caltech. You'll see Ed working with his co-author, Jack Calvin, in this picture circa 1932 in Alaska. And Calvin was magnificent in smoothing out Ed's sometimes very dense prose. And you'll see him with Ridge Lovejoy, whose illustrations add so much to Ricketts's descriptions of the animals that he and Calvin collected. You know, among the many misconceptions about Ed Ricketts that are created by Steinbeck's fictional portraits is that he was kind of a quirky loner, that he drank too much, that he was sometimes ragged in appearance, that he always worked alone in his lab on Ocean Avenue. In fact, the opposite is really the case. No, he did drink a lot, but he was very conscious of his appearance when he wasn't dissecting or preparing specimens. Check this photograph taken in Chicago when he was at the university before he ever even came to Monterey. He dressed well. He went to San Francisco for haircuts. Here he is just back from work. He was very social, not just among a small circle of friends. He was a regular attendee at gatherings in Monterey and PG, and particularly in Carmel, mingling at Gustav and Lucille Lanistock's Cimarron, showed here on the left, with the likes of Henry Miller and Robinson Jeffers and Lincoln Steffens and his wife Ella Winter, Sinclair Lewis and Edward Weston, and even Charlie Chaplin Shelfer. Ricketts mingled with composer John Cage, whom he recruited to work on the book's index. At one point, he was more than friendly with Cage's wife, Xenia. He enjoyed time with the members of the Kashavarov outfit, Xenia and the other daughters of the Alaskan Archbishop, and with Calvin and Campbell collecting on the Grampus in Southeast Alaska. We'd go out in a little canoe that Jack had, wrote Campbell, and every time there'd be a good low tide, we'd collect. We'd gather those gonionimus. It was a beautiful trip, canoeing, reading, listening to Stravinsky, snapping photographs, taking long walks through parks of native totem poles. In a Tidal Odyssey, you'll see Ricketts's complex relationship with Walter Fisher, who Don mentioned, the accomplished but very traditional longtime director at Hopkins, whose less than favorable comments about Ricketts's efforts to popularize science in between Pacific tides added to the long delays in the book's publication. And you'll see a savvy, very politically astute Ricketts, who was in the end able to convince Fisher of the book's value without ever compromising its point of view. And you'll see Ricketts's tactful handling of the director and the editors at the Stanford University Press. Don referenced all these letters, these files. And, the people at the press were understandably worried about publishing costs. And after all, it was the middle of the Great Depression. It's accepted that what made Tides revolutionary was its ecological rather than its taxonomic organization. This is certainly true. But Ricketts hardly invented the field. Linnaeus was talking about ecology in the 18th century. Von Humboldt and Darwin studied animals according to habitat a half century before Ed was born. W.C. Ali, his mentor at the University of Chicago on the left here, conducted ecological studies at Woods Hole before Ricketts ever enrolled at the university. And Robert Park had taken Ali's work on animal aggregations into the world of human sociology 2 decades before Ricketts and Steinbeck did the same in Sea of Cortez. Now, what is really revolutionary about Between Pacific Tides is that its organization is subjective and experiential. Information that the text offers anticipates exactly what a novice like me, or any layman willing to take the time to read it, can understand, can appreciate. Aaron Hirsch, the University of Colorado, noticed this a few years ago, writing that about each animal, we are told not just a Latin name, but something to grab hold of, something intriguing. That Latia gigantea, for example, changes sex from male to female as it grows, and that it defends its territory, pursuing and bulldozing off any invader, who after all knew that a limpet could bulldoze anything. The book's perspective is subjective and experiential in another way as well. Ricketts shares his sympathetic inference of animal experience, writing about what he calls the pleasant and absurd hermit crabs, the clowns of the tide pools. He tells us when they are not busy scavenging or lovemaking, the gregarious hermits fight with tireless enthusiasm. In the Tidal Odyssey, we read Ricketts's notes, his letters about his collecting. We also read reflections about those expeditions by those who sometimes accompanied him. His wife, Nan, his son, Ed Jr., his daughter, Nancy, who's with us tonight, the McGinnitys, Torstein Giesland, Chin Yip, and Gabe McNell, the prototype for Mac and the Boys. Ricketts takes us with him into the tide pools, where he sees, he smells, he experiences the hot taste of life. Between Pacific Tides, it's all about that hot taste of life. It's about the intertidal zones, and it's about us as we wade with him through those zones, the mud flats, the rocky shores. He teaches us without seeming to. As Joseph Campbell told the anthropologist Franz Boa, Ed was at the heart of it all. And what about us today? What do we learn today from Between Pacific Tides? Yes, Ed helps us see life on the seashore. But from there, he helps us see beyond ourselves. Or as he and Steinbeck write in Sea of Cortez, to look from the tide pool to the stars and back to the tide pool again. This way of seeing inspires what we call citizen science. Collaborations between scientists and those of us who are curious, concerned, motivated to make a difference. In the end, it's all about connections between observation and quantification. Ray Sagarin, himself a science popularizer, the one-time Hopkins graduate student who took Bill Clinton and Al Gore into Ricketts' tide pools, wrote, "You know, I got to thinking about the long chains of observation and about scientific knowledge and the links that are forged between students and teachers, between historical figures and those who read and follow the work they left behind." Mary Ellen Hannibal, the author of Citizen Scientist, is right on the mark when she writes, "I think citizen scientist is a compliment Ricketts would gladly accept. After all, citizen is communal, not only one member among many in one place and at one time, but across boundaries as well." Those who knew Ed and read Between Pacific Tides when it was published in 1939 were surely enriched. Fast forward 80 plus years, and we know that understanding relationships between living creatures and their environments and acting on the basis of that understanding is more crucial to the well-being of our planet now than any time in human history. The RV Rachel Carson, shown here on the left, began work at MBARI, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute at Moss Landing in 2011. It is there today, adjacent to the ROV Doc Ricketts, which provides MBARI scientists with an unmanned submersible research platform. And beside it, on the slide to the right, is the RV Western Flyer, named after the boat that Steinbeck and Ricketts took to the Sea of Cortez, that was designed and constructed for MBARI to serve as a support vessel for the ROV Doc Ricketts. An outdoor sculpture depicting Rachel Carson was installed in Waterfront Park near the legendary MBL in Woods Hole on July 14th, 2013. On that very same day, July 14th, 1 year later, a memorial sculpture of Ed Ricketts was unveiled on Cannery Road. Yeah, Ed Ricketts has finally found his place with Carson in the scientific sun. Recognized for the important work he did in his time and that can inspire us in our time. His voice is one we should hear and from which we can learn. Thank you, and I hope those of you who will read A Tidal Odyssey will share with Don and with me the joy of the Ricketts experience. Thank you. And I'll turn it back, Sean, to you. And Tim.
Thank you so much, Richard and Don. That was amazing. I'm excited to get my hands on the book. Tim?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. That was terrific. I really appreciate it. It was really good.
So at this time, we'd like to open up the floor to anyone who has questions for Don or Richard. Please feel free to enter them into the chat if you would like, or unmute yourself and ask away.
I have a question. So, John, and Richard, in your research, did you ever run across I was run across a letter from Fish and Game when talking about Ricketts and Ricketts' then partner Gallagher applying for a job to work as inspectors in the canneries in the early 1920s?
I haven't, Don.
No, I have not. I would like to see that.
Well, it shouldn't be
letter.
at the Monterey Library. I should have that letter. But yeah, and it's a funny letter because it's written by one of the Schofield brothers, and they're talking because their business was just new and they weren't making a lot of money, and they applied to be inspectors in the canneries. And according to Schofield, hey, we can get these guys to work cheap because they didn't have any college degrees. I don't think they ever worked for Fish and Game, but I just thought it was interesting.
Well, you know, if he'd taken that job at Ricketts, he probably would have made a lot more money than he ever did off of Between Pacific Tides for royalties or Sea of Cortez. He doesn't make hardly anything.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
Yeah,
It's a story
sure.
within itself. Questions?
Yeah, I have a question. How many editions has BPT gone through? I thought it was up to about 7. Maybe is it more than that now? Or am I wrong about that?
No, Don, it's what? It's 4, isn't it?
Oh,
I think it's
4, okay.
5 fifth
It's-
edition
no, it's-
and lots of printings.
I'm sorry, it's 5. Yeah, the Phillips one is, I think, number 5. No, Steinbeck did the preface to number 2
2, right.
that came out right after Ed was killed in the car wreck, in the car crash. Then Joel Hedspeth did the revisions to number 3 and number 4, and Phillips did number 5.
And when was
the book
the
has
5th
never
one?
been out of print.
When I knew that. When was the 5th one done?
Oh, I
it
think in
2005?
1980s.
The 80s sometime? Yeah.
And
Was it
Stanford
that far
University
back?
Press would
Okay.
love to find somebody to do another one, but you just can't find anybody in marine ecology that can do what Ed does, or Ed did. Become familiar with and identify all those invertebrates along the shoreline. It was a huge project.
Thank
You
you.
know, I think Bob, one of the really interesting things that I learned along the way here is, you know, I talked to a bunch of people. I mentioned the one guy from the University of Chicago and the fella up in Euclid, but I talked to a bunch of people who are practicing scientists and very accomplished, and a number of them said that it was Between Pacific Tides that got them into the business in the first place. That's how they got turned on as undergraduates. The book has really had an impact.
I can believe that. Yeah.
Thank you. So it looks like we got a couple questions in the chat. I'm just going to read them going down the line. The first one is, did the 1939 edition of Between Pacific Tides originally have a dust jacket? I have been devouring your books lately and love them.
No dust jacket that I know of.
No, I've never seen one.
All right, thank you.
The 1948 edition did.
But not the original 1939.
No, not that I've ever seen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Is Doc Ricketts technology is still used today?
Yeah, identifying invertebrates. Oh, definitely. Yes. And that's the beauty of Ed's book, is it can take you into a specific location in the intertidal zone and help you become familiar with those invertebrates in a timely fashion. You can go to the mudflats. You can go to the wharf pilings. You can walk into the intertidal zone of a rocky shore. And they're spread out in Ed's book and spread out in front of you in the intertidal zone are the species of the most conspicuous that Ed helped identify and talk about.
Yeah, actually, Sean, and on top of that, there is, for example, it's going on, I believe it's still going on now. There is a group of marine guys in Sitka, in Alaska, who are basically following Ricketts' steps and assessing what's going on in those same tide pools now as compared to what was going on in the 1930s. And they're doing this sequentially to look at basically change, ecological change. and everything is building on between Pacific tides. I think the group is headed by, Don, if I'm not mistaken, Pete Raimondi at UC Santa Cruz. So Ricketts's work is still very much in fashion.
Thank you. Next one. Thanks for the fine overview. Any thoughts on the report that Steinbeck got rid of at least some of the Ricketts correspondence after Ricketts' death?
Very likely. Richard,
Very
you want to
likely. Very likely. I mean, he came to California. He got here or there, in Florida, right after Ed died. And he certainly went to the lab and was cleaning stuff out. So very likely he got rid of stuff that he didn't want to see the light of day. Sure.
Okay, thank you. Did Doc Ricketts have formal education outside of, how did he get any formal education?
Well, yeah, he enrolled, I mean, after high school, he enrolled at Illinois State Normal, which is an education college just west of Chicago. He was there for a year. He dropped out. He went on a walking tour into the Southwest. When he came back, he enrolled at the University of Chicago, and he was there for a couple of years. That's where he encountered W.C. Ali. I mean, the University of Chicago had, even at that time, had become the center of basically ecology, ecological study. That's where Ed got turned on to it. He left without a degree and came to California. He had two roommates. Albert Gallagher was, of course, one and was his partner when he came. But there was another fellow named Gowanlock as well. These guys had graduate degrees. So he learned certainly from them. But he himself, no, was not formally credentialed.
All right, thank you very much. The next, these are from two separate people. Tim says, my 5th edition of Between Pacific Tides is copyright 1985. And from Jean, what is added or changed in each new edition? What is needed now?
Don, go ahead.
Well, the information is continually updated. Hedgepeth took on the 3rd edition after Ed had passed away, and he made some changes. He held on to it till, I believe, the 5th edition, and the material was updated, references were updated, and it'd be interesting to have invertebrate specialists suggest what is needed now in terms of to do Between Pacific Tides to bring it to the next level. I'm sure there's a bit of work there in terms of just all the research that's now being done in terms of intertidal ecology since 1985, like Tim mentioned. It's been a long time.
Mhm.
Yeah, I should add that Jim Carlton, who ran the Williams College Marine program at Mystic Seaport and has been in the business for a very long time, and who is very familiar with every edition of Between Pacific Tides. He told me, and he's an expert, I'm not, that while the book is still very relevant, it does need an update from 1985.
Thank you. Next question. Any studies how climate change may have or possibly will change the science of what is written in Between Pacific Tides?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what Raimondi and his group are doing. They're basically, assessing what has changed in the intertidal zones because of changes in climate. Because obviously that will impact, what animals are where and when. So certainly it's extremely relevant. It's extremely important.
Thank you. How many copies of the first two editions were published?
I can take that one. 1,000 copies of the first edition were published. 3,000 copies of the revised edition. That was released shortly after Ed's death. The galleys for the revised edition were on his way to Ed when he got hit by the train and passed away. So it was
Really?
very close to being completed. Another story of publishing with Stanford University Press that took 9 years.
Thank you. Our next question is what Ricketts did for oceanography transfers to or impacts other biological efforts. So what Ricketts did for oceanography, does it transfer or impact other biological efforts?
Well, I mean, first, I think you have to distinguish between oceanography and intertidal biology.
Mhm.
They're very different. Ed Ricketts was not an oceanographer. You know, he never went far out to sea, really. But I think the answer to the question is yeah, and that's why I referenced, you know, citizen science. I just chanced upon Mary Ellen Hannibal's book about a year ago. But when you read it, you can see that she takes her cues from Ricketts and is doing all kinds of other stuff. And, you know, I think, again, what I think is most important to me about that book is that it can reach people like me. It can inspire me to get involved in ways that, you know, most scientific books are not going to do. I mean, they'll put me to sleep. Between Pacific Tides didn't.
Thank you. This one, can you update us on the restoration of the Western Flyer? Tim, you and I might be able to answer this one.
Yeah, Tim, I think you're
That'd be
probably
great. Could
more
you
up to date
update us
than
on
me.
that flyer?
Is Susan here today? As I understand, it will be. I think this summer is going to make its trip from Washington down the West Coast to Monterey, and it should be here sometime early in the fall. I think.
I believe
It's going to make stops along the way at different town, and then we'll be in Monterey sometime. I think in October. I think is what they said.
That's what I remember, and that's about what we know. Unfortunately, the Western Flyer Foundation will have much more information on the restoration and updates on where it is and its restoration. So it looks like a couple more. You piqued my interest on many levels. What about Ed Ricketts' methodology is in use today? Like how he recorded his notes, seasonal notes, etc.
Well, I mean,
No.
technology has changed just a little bit. You know, when I look at the cards that Don showed us earlier this evening, and I think back, you know, to when I was in graduate school, you know, working on a typewriter, or rather my wife was typing my stuff on a typewriter, you know, using carbon paper, for God's sake. You know, I think if Ed was with us today, he would be able to do a lot more and a whole lot more quickly than he was able to do in 1935. I think it's really a marvel that his collections are just so grand. There's so much of it. He was an inveterate collector, you know, and I think neither Don nor I mentioned the fact that there was a fire that burned down the whole bloody lab and destroyed all kinds of stuff. And still we have these files. It's really a marvel.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if you guys know, what might Steinbeck have destroyed in Ricketts' lab when he was cleaning it out?
I don't know, probably the personal stuff.
the personal information.
Yeah.
There was a suitcase that went up for auction about 12 or 14 years ago. And it appears to have some layers of correspondences. There is lots of material still coming to light on Ricketts. And you never know what's going to show up. We've just, scratched the surface in this book.
And we're not trying to make the guy out as some kind of a saint.
No.
He was a fine scientist, albeit largely self-taught. But he was a human being who was flawed like the rest of us. People have said he was a great environmentalist. And yeah, he wrote those articles about the depletion of the sardine industry in Monterey, absolutely. But on the other hand, he collected a lot of monarch butterflies. And if you're in Pacific Grove, you know the monarchs. And I gather he collected so many that the city of Pacific Grove passed an ordinance forbidding collecting of monarch butterflies. And it was aimed at him. So sure, so who knows what Steinbeck, found and tore up.
Thank you. And that's the end of the questions in the chat. If anyone else has any more questions, please feel free to unmute yourself.
I think that's it.
Think so.
Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Sean. Thanks
Thank
everybody
you.
showing up.
And
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for spending an hour with us tonight. We really enjoyed it.
Thanks for giving us an hour.
Yes. Our pleasure.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, John, for spending some time with us and sharing us your book. Very excited, and we look forward to Tim's next program next month, which we do this every month. So thank you very much, and have a great evening. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.